Thanks for being here. Today, we're exploring one of the most pivotal and quietly unfolding transformations in global geopolitics, one that centers around India, the world's most populous democracy and a rising economic juggernaut. As the balance of power in Asia and beyond continues to shift, India is methodically re-evaluating its long-standing alliances and rivalries, particularly with two global heavyweights, the United States and China. This recalibration is not sudden. It's not dramatic or loud, but it is deliberate and deeply strategic. It reflects a growing recognition in New Delhi that the rules of the international game have changed, and that loyalty to old alliances doesn't guarantee security, support, or even mutual respect in today's global environment. Let's begin with the United States, India's most prominent democratic partner and, for many years, a key defense and trade ally. Under the leadership of President Trump, Washington took an increasingly transactional approach to its global relationships. For India, this translated into mounting pressure to align with U.S. foreign policy goals, particularly around isolating Russia economically. When India chose instead to continue purchasing Russian energy, because it suited its national interest, Trump publicly condemned the move. His administration accused India of ignoring global responsibility, choosing instead what it described as opportunism. But for Indian policymakers, the message from Washington was clear. U.S. support came with strings attached. India's refusal to bow to this pressure was a statement of sovereignty. New Delhi was saying, in no uncertain terms, that it would not compromise its energy security or economic autonomy for the sake of pleasing an increasingly erratic ally. To reinforce that message, India quietly paused its imports of American weaponry. A symbolic yet consequential move, considering how central defense sales are to U.S. foreign influence. This wasn't merely a pause in arms deals. It was a warning shot. It was India asserting that its foreign and economic policies would no longer be tethered to the fluctuating political whims of Washington. But the tension didn't stop there. In July, the Trump administration hit Indian exports with a 25% tariff, targeting a wide range of goods. Just a month later, a second 25% tariff followed, this time clearly linked to India's decision to continue trading with Russia. This escalation caught New Delhi off guard. For decades, India had worked to position itself as a dependable partner in the Indo-Pacific, a democratic counterbalance to China. Yet here it was, being penalized as though it were an adversary. And so India found itself at a crossroads. It could double down on a relationship that was proving increasingly one-sided. Or it could begin to forge a new path. That new path didn't lead westward, it turned east. By the end of 2024, the signs of strategic redirection were unmistakable. In October, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi sat down with Chinese President Xi Jinping for the first time in 5 years. That meeting marked a dramatic thaw in relations following the deadly Galwan Valley clash in 2020, where tensions along the disputed Himalayan border turned violent, leading to a complete freeze in bilateral engagement. Following that conflict, India had taken decisive steps to economically decouple from China. It banned over 300 Chinese mobile applications, tightened scrutiny over Chinese investments, and put new barriers in place to restrict Beijing's influence within Indian markets. Diplomatic communication was reduced to the bare minimum. Trust was fractured. The relationship was, for all practical purposes, frozen. Yet in October something changed. Modi and Xi shared a stage, exchanged diplomatic courtesies, and began what appears to be a tentative process of rebuilding ties. It was a quiet moment, but not a small one. For India, it signaled a willingness to step back from confrontation and consider cooperation, albeit carefully and on its own terms. This re-engagement also sent a message to the West. India will not be boxed into binary choices. It will not be forced to choose between Beijing and Washington. Instead, it is carving out a third path, one rooted in multipolar diplomacy, self-interest, and strategic ambiguity. Meanwhile, symbolic and practical gestures began to emerge. Indian troops resumed patrols in areas along the disputed border, actions that suggest a restoration of basic military protocols and confidence-building measures. On the Chinese side, authorities reopened pilgrimage routes to Kailash Mansarovar, a sacred site for Indian Hindu and Buddhist pilgrims, that had been closed since the Galwan incident. This reopening wasn't just a goodwill gesture. It was a calculated signal that both sides are prepared to manage their differences through diplomacy, not confrontation. What makes this entire geopolitical shift so significant is not just the countries involved, but the larger implications. For much of the post-Cold War period, global diplomacy has been dominated by binary choices. You're either with us or against us. India is rejecting that framework. It is embracing a nuanced, interest-based approach to foreign policy, one that resists being pulled too far into either the American or Chinese sphere of influence. And this is about more than India. This is a signal to the rest of the developing world, from Southeast Asia to Latin America to Africa, that middle powers can and should exercise agency in global affairs, that you don't have to choose a side in someone else's power struggle, that economic and strategic autonomy is not only possible but increasingly essential in an era of unpredictable alliances. Washington, for its part, appears to have miscalculated. It has mistaken India's silence for compliance, and its pragmatism for passivity. But New Delhi is neither passive nor compliant. It is watching, learning, and adjusting. What it is doing now is not abandoning the US, but it is preparing for a world where American partnership may not be as stable or as beneficial as it once seemed. In sum, what we're witnessing is India's long game, a strategic repositioning that acknowledges a fragmented, unpredictable world and chooses flexibility over loyalty, leverage over dependence. As tensions continue to rise across the globe, India's new approach may well become a blueprint for other nations seeking to assert their sovereignty without burning bridges. The era of unipolar dominance is ending. The age of pragmatic diplomacy is rising, and India is positioning itself, quietly but firmly, right at its center. Tourist visas reopened. Civil society exchanges resumed. On the surface, these may seem like small symbolic gestures, but in diplomacy, symbolism matters. This wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't a warm embrace. But it was a beginning. A carefully measured thaw after years of icy silence and mounting tensions between Asia's two largest powers, India and China. The move wasn't born of friendship or trust. It was rooted in pragmatism. Behind this shift lay a simple yet unavoidable truth. China controls over 60% of global electronics manufacturing. In today's interconnected world, where semiconductors, components, and circuit boards fuel everything from smartphones to strategic defense systems, cutting China out of the equation is not just difficult, it's almost impossible. And for India, the economic consequences of trying to do so were already visible. Indian companies were estimated to have lost more than $15 billion due to earlier curbs and restrictions on Chinese suppliers. That's not pocket change, that's an economic wound. So no, this wasn't surrender. It was strategy, a realignment, a recalibration. But of course the optics were messy. Western analysts and media outlets, always eager to interpret geopolitical shifts through a binary lens, were quick to frame India's re-engagement with China as a submission, a retreat, a sign that New Delhi was buckling under Beijing's pressure. Yet that interpretation misses the mark. It's not just reductive, it's misleading. This isn't about giving in. This is about adapting to an increasingly complex and volatile world. A world where even long-standing alliances are no longer reliable. Where partnerships that once came with implicit guarantees now come with conditions, unpredictability, and, sometimes, outright hostility. To understand India's recent maneuvering, we need to zoom out and look at the broader geopolitical landscape, especially India's evolving relationship with the United States. During Trump's presidency, India, like many other U.S. allies, found itself navigating a minefield of erratic policy shifts and transactional diplomacy. Tariffs on Indian goods were imposed with little warning. Trade privileges and exemptions that had existed for decades were suddenly frozen or revoked. Worse still, energy imports, vital for India's growing economy, were politicized. Trump's administration imposed secondary sanctions that effectively punished India for doing business with countries like Iran, undermining its strategic autonomy. And then came the diplomatic slights. One particularly telling moment was Trump drawing false equivalence between Pakistan's military establishment and India's elected leadership, placing a democratic prime minister and a military general on the same moral and political plane. That sent shockwaves through South Bloc. It was more than a gaffe. It was a signal that Washington's understanding of South Asia had been reduced to transactional headlines. Under such conditions, what options did India really have? With the US growing more insular, more unpredictable, and in many ways more belligerent on the global stage, simultaneously embroiled in a proxy war in Ukraine and actively bankrolling Israel's controversial war in the Middle East, the space for nuance in foreign policy began to shrink. Countries like India, which have long prided themselves on maintaining strategic autonomy, were suddenly being asked to pick sides in conflicts they had little stake in. Meanwhile, China, despite its many problems, offered something the US did not: predictability. Its policies may be aggressive, its actions often questionable, but its behavior followed a certain logic. Beijing, for all its flaws, doesn't shift course every election cycle. It doesn't burn bridges with allies over minor disagreements. And in today's fractured world order, that kind of consistency matters. India's leadership understands this. And that's why we're seeing what looks like a pivot, but is really a hedging strategy. India still seeks to become the world's third largest economy. That ambition hasn't changed. But the path to that goal runs through capital investment, technological access, and stable supply chains, all of which require diversified partnerships, not blind loyalty. So India is recalibrating. It's neither embracing China nor rejecting the United States. It's playing the long game, keeping channels open, hedging its bets, and above all, protecting its national interests. It is asserting its independence not just through rhetoric, but through action. And that includes the tough, uncomfortable decision to re-engage with China in certain areas, even as tensions persist at the border. Is the relationship with China perfect? Far from it. The line of actual control remains a flashpoint. Trust is minimal. Trade is imbalanced. But engagement isn't endorsement. Dialogue isn't dependency. It's a way of managing risk while maximizing opportunity. And let's not forget, this strategy isn't unique to India. Across the globe, nations are reassessing their alliances. France is pursuing strategic autonomy from the US. Germany is rethinking its energy policy. Even traditional American allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are cozying up to China and Russia, building parallel partnerships that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. Why? Because the global order is shifting. The old rules no longer apply. The idea of a unipolar world led by a rational, rules-based America is fading, and in its place is a chaotic, multipolar reality, one where pragmatism often trumps principle. In this new world, India's pivot, or rather its balancing act, isn't a betrayal of values. It's a recognition of reality. A world where US loyalty can't be counted on, and where China, despite being a competitor and at times a rival, is still an economic powerhouse with which some level of engagement is unavoidable. This is not about siding with Beijing. It's about not being cornered by Washington. India is holding firm where it matters, on sovereignty, on defense, on territorial integrity. But it's also yielding where it makes sense, on trade, on technology, on diplomacy. Because the stakes are too high to let ideology override pragmatism. This is the essence of modern Indian diplomacy. Flexibility without compromise, engagement without dependence, sovereignty without isolation. So what does the future hold? Perhaps India is simply buying time, waiting out the current political cycle in the US, hoping for a return to a more stable, predictable Washington. Or perhaps it's preparing for